chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, as a heading, a general statement about his relationship to the law, which is saying, in spite of the fact that we're going to have a series of contrasts in the form, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, that Jesus has no intention to abolish the law, and that what Jesus is teaching, rather than constituting an abolition of the law, really is a fulfillment of God's purposes. And there's a lot of discussion about the term fulfill. My own suspicion is that Jesus is saying that what he is unfolding is the intent of God, revealed in part in the law, but now brought to full revelation in Jesus. So as you look at these six contrasts, and these six may be chosen because they were especially relevant to the audience to which Matthew was writing, you find that in each case they represent Jewish belief, but not in each case something that is found in the law. Sometimes it's in the law, sometimes it seems to be a rabbinic tradition, sometimes we may not even know exactly where it comes from. And it appears as you go through these that sometimes Jesus is deepening what the Old Testament says, and at other times he seems to abrogate what the Old Testament says, and sometimes he seems to do both, although it is my conviction that really what he is doing in every single one of these six cases is that he is deepening the basic idea and driving it home to the heart and talking about what a person is in their inner self. So yesterday afternoon we had worked through murder in Matthew 5:21 through 26, or the text on murder, and adultery and divorce and swearing. And you may have noticed in divorce that I tried to sidestep all the difficult issues. Gordon Teal is here, and he will answer any questions you have on that issue. And if not Gordon, then there are many experts. There are many experts around on that issue, so just grab anybody who looks like they know what they're talking about and ask them for the truth on the marriage and divorce and remarriage and divorce and remarriage and divorce and remarriage issue. And then we talked about swearing, and then we got down to retaliation, which may be the most difficult one of all, because retaliation is so natural to us. If you don't believe that, how many of you enjoy watching Rambo? I mean, Rambo sold a lot of tickets, and the basic premise of Rambo, all the Rambos, is retaliation. And some people just love Charles Bronson movies or Chuck Norris movies, all those kinds of films, and the basic premise of most of those is retaliation. Now, we as Christians would never do that ourselves, but how we love to see is treated wretchedly by the villains, but we know before it's over that the chief villain is going to get his nose bloodied, and probably these days is going to be blown into bits or kicked into bits or something, and it's sort of like, yeah, get him in the end, you know, because that, though we don't retaliate because we're Christians, that love of seeing people get even is such a little distance beneath the surface that we enjoy that kind of thing, which, by the way, I think is one of the ways in which our culture influences us that we don't realize. Our culture is constantly talking about the gratification one gets from retaliation. Jesus says not to retaliate. Not even if I'm in Matthew 5:38 through 42. And I made the point yesterday, I believe it's a valid point. You may object, and you have that right, and I may be wrong, but it seems to me that there is a distinction to be made between vengeance or retaliation, which is rooted in one's own ego, and which has nothing to do with love. There is a difference between that and the seeking of justice, which is not a personal desire to get even, and which can be a manifestation of love, because we are calling upon, or we are somehow working for justice to be done for those who are underprivileged, or those who are victims, whatever it might be. But we have to be very, very careful, if we are people who seek justice, that we are not at the same time people who seek retaliation. And that's a very difficult line. And sometimes we can say, I'm only seeking justice, when really the truth is that we are seeking retaliation. So you can play with that and see. Is saying to us that God is the ultimate administrator of justice, that all wrongs will be rectified. God will see to that. If we literally followed what about non-retaliation, we would be much less materialistic, and we would be much less egocentric, the two things about which the Lord speaks in the next chapter. And, of course, I think we need to keep in mind that if we are engaged in retaliation, we cannot be engaged in love. The two exclude each other. Retaliation excludes love, love excludes retaliation. So I guess the way through this maze, if we're trying to decide what kind of behavior to adopt, is to say, no matter what happens, I will see to it that my actions are actions of love. And I believe if we adopt that rule that we will probably proceed in the correct way. And if we seek justice, then we must seek justice in love, and hopefully that will keep us from going over the line and seeking retaliation. I think what Jesus is teaching on non-retaliation is saying that God accepts me, and no matter what you do to me, you can't hurt me, because I am accepted by God. Very close to the teaching on non-retaliation is the last paragraph in Matthew chapter 5 on love of one's enemies. In fact, they are so close that if you look at Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 27 and going down through that paragraph and the next paragraph, the Sermon on the Plain, you will find that many statements made here about retaliation and in this paragraph about love of one's enemies are combined in Luke, and they are used under the heading of love of one's enemies, showing that the same illustrations can be applied to both situations because they're so very close. So I'm reading now beginning in Matthew 5:43. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, sends rain on the just and on the unjust. If you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?" And then a verse which may summarize all of this 5th chapter. "You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." You shall love your neighbor is Leviticus 19:18. The second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, is from the Old Testament. Hate your enemy is not in the Old Testament. I got a bit confused yesterday when I was talking about murder and confused this with the passage that's earlier, but the idea of hating one's enemy is found in the Psalms, a number of places when you have the curses in the Psalms, the cursing Psalms, the imprecations. So it was there in the Jewish thought world, illustrations of that. Jesus says one of the most radical things he ever said, and one of the most difficult to apply: love your enemies. I think we all understand that the word love here is not an emotion word. It's not saying go up and hug them. It is saying will their good. It is, the definition we give is active goodwill. Be concerned about their well-being. Be as concerned about theirs as you are concerned about yours. Be as concerned about theirs as God is concerned about theirs. Whether or not it involves emotions, the chances are it won't, although it may evolve into emotions. But you seek their well-being rather than seeking to harm them. And so you see how close it is to the idea of retaliation. He parallels it by saying, pray for those who persecute you. If you read Luke's account, he adds, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you. And why are we to do such a radical thing? We are to do such a radical thing because God does this, which includes all of us who have been enemies of God, even those of us who are nice people and were reared in Christian homes. Isn't that what our theology says? And others as well. And the way in which Jesus talks about this here is in terms of natural blessings, the sun and the rain, which come on good and on evil. But the point is, we are called upon to love enemies because God does. The whole story of the gospel, that God loves his enemies. And then in case people mistake what he says, Jesus says, I'm not talking about loving those who are a natural love, and unredeemed people do that. Maybe there are some people so inured to love that they won't even love those who love them, but most people do. That's just natural. And Jesus says, I'm not talking about that. Not that he condemns that. We'll do that, but he says, I'm talking about something more, that you are called upon to love your enemies. We talked yesterday about young men who go into battle. Can a Christian be a soldier, go into battle, and love his enemies? I'm not answering that. You've had that argument. We had a lady in Austin, Sister Margaretta Young, who's since died, or Jung, whose husband had I think a junkyard or a used car place or something outside of town, and he was out there working one night, and a man broke in and killed him and robbed the place. Was caught, was convicted, was put in prison, and Sister Jung, for the next, I don't know how many years until she died, made it a mission of her life to get in touch with that man, to write him, to love him, to demonstrate by her relationship to him that rather than seeking vengeance on him for having murdered her husband, she was demonstrating the Spirit of Christ and showing love for the enemy. It would be great if I could say that the end of that story is that he became a Christian. I don't know that he did. But I just thought it was remarkable in a situation where many, many people could harbor the deepest kind of resentment, that she took the teaching of Christ with absolute seriousness and spent the rest of her life demonstrating in any way that she could, including even going over to Huntsville, Texas and visiting the prison, visiting him, demonstrating in any way that she could her love for him. This is love for people who hate you. This is love for people who do not love you back. This is love for people who do not deserve to be loved. Well, they don't deserve it. It doesn't matter. This kind of love has nothing to do with the character of the beloved. It has everything to do with the nature of God as it is wrought through the lover. Love your enemies. So those of you who preach, that means those guys who write you up and tell lies about you without having checked out the facts. It means that person who has done great damage to you or someone whom you love, someone in your family. It means someone who has cheated you in a business deal, and because they've cheated you, they've robbed you of all the money you had saved up for retirement. Whatever it might be, love your enemies. Now, I don't think this rules out, again, the quest for justice, but it says that you are as concerned for their well-being as you are for your own. And I would say in the ultimate sense, you are concerned, if it is at all possible, that they find a relationship to Christ. I think in every one of these 6 contrasts that what Jesus is really doing is he's taking what the Jews believed and he is pushing the implications of that to the ultimate. So it's more than a matter of killing, it's a matter of the attitude. It's more than a matter of adultery, it's a matter of the attitude. And by the way, you can't divorce one of the silliest interpretations I ever heard, where someone says, Jesus says if you have lust in your heart, you've committed adultery, so that's just the same as if you committed the act, so that's grounds for divorce. And that isn't the point that Jesus is making at all. With regard to divorce, Jesus is saying it's more than just giving someone a certificate of divorce, it's a commitment to the relationship. That is the deeper will of God. You recall in Matthew 19 that when Jesus talked about the rationale for staying together in marriage, he went back to creation. In swearing, you're going beyond an oath in God's name, you're going all the way to the character of the person who follows Christ. Retaliation, you're going beyond limited retaliation to no retaliation. Love, you're going beyond loving your neighbor to loving your enemy. And if you love your enemy, if you go, that's as far as you can travel on that road, the love road. And if you love your enemy, there's no one else not to love, because everybody else is somewhere on the road this side of the enemy, which says that there is no exclusion, that in terms of the Christian giving love, there is no one who is excluded. I can think, and you can think of some very repulsive people. How would you feel if you were a relative of one of the 22 people killed in Killeen, toward the man who apparently for no good reason killed them? Of course, he's dead now, but suppose he were alive. And I don't know who those people were, but I would guess, knowing Killeen, Texas, that some of them, and knowing our people who love to eat in cafeterias, that some of them were probably members of the church. And it wouldn't surprise me when I find out who they are that some of them may be relatives of students I've had, because I've had a number of students from the Killeen, Belton Temple area, and it wouldn't surprise me what John York's brother is going to know who some of them are, because he preaches there in Temple. How would you feel? Then we come to the next chapter, which I've said it seems to me, can be outlined in terms of two false gods that Jesus warns people about. And the first of these is the god of ego, which he discusses by using three illustrations in the first 18 verses of piety: to be seen by men, for if you do, you'll get no reward from your Father who is in heaven. It is possible to do your good deeds, to be seen by men, and to be praised by men. And you can do that if you want. And you will get a reward. They'll think you're hot stuff. But you will miss a reward. You will miss the reward from your Father who is in heaven. So don't do it to be seen by men, but rather do it as an act of devotion to God and as an act of love for other people. Not trying to impress people with what you've done, but just doing it because it's good, because it's right. And then you receive your reward from God. I've been talking to different ones this week, and Bill Love and I have talked a bit, and Bill has mentioned several times what is one of the greatest problems with preachers, and that is our egos. It's very difficult, for example, to come to a place like this and deliver a lecture without asking the question beforehand, what are people going to think about my lecture? Is it going to be one of those where they come up and say, wow, that was, the greatest thing I ever heard? I don't believe people when they say that, because the people who say that say it about every third Sunday. That's the greatest sermon I ever heard. And it's very difficult not to do that. I delivered that lecture last Sunday at church, and a very perceptive man in the church came up afterwards and said, it's interesting you noticed that. I said it was difficult for two reasons. One is the reason I mentioned. It's hard to get into that emotionally. The other reason was it's hard not to ask, what are they going to think of me? See, we stand back there at the door, shaking hands as people go out, of course ostensibly to see who the visitors are, but we really kind of enjoy people going by and saying how good the sermon was. And people tell us those things so often we sometimes come to believe them. Tremendous ego problems. We all have ego problems. Religious leaders have ego problems. It's hard, to make a large gift and not somehow let people know we've made a large gift. Or whatever it is, to be praised by men. We want so much to be, and even in the church, to be praised by men. I think of the guy, who's invited to lead the prayer, at lecture, lead the prayer. And so he gets up there, and instead of saying, Father in heaven, he says, God. And then he goes on from there. And it's more like a sermon than a prayer, giving God a good deal of information that we weren't sure God prayer, and think that man, we need that man for a meeting. We need to have that man come and speak at our church. And wow, he's good, sort of thing. So Jesus uses three illustrations. He uses the illustration of almsgiving. Don't sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites, the play actors do. In the synagogues and the streets, they may be seen by men. They get what they're after, but they don't get the thing that's more important, the reward from God. So do it secretly. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand does, or left hand what your right. I don't know what all that business is, but what difference does it make? It means do it quietly, secretly, not to impress people. Maybe it's the idea that you're so secretive about it that not even one hand knows what the other one has done. It's an extreme illustration. Some Sunday I'm going to preach on this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to find about 4 or 5 kinds of noisemakers. A little cricket, click, click, and then a whistle. And as the ultimate noisemaker, I've got a ram's horn I got in South America, and that thing is so loud that when I blow it in the house, my dog starts barking, gets scared. And I'm going to take those in the pulpit, I think, and say, now, brethren, here's the system. If you give $25, you get a cricket click. And if you give $50, you get the whistle, and so on up. And if you give $500, you get the ram's horn. And we're going to pass these out, and when the contribution is taken, everybody use your noisemaker to indicate how much you're giving. And if you give me $1,000, you get to blow the ram's horn twice. And all this kind of bit. We want to hear those ram's horns, brethren. We don't want to hear those clickers. We want to hear those ram's horns. Come on, let's hear it. Can you imagine anybody who's about to make a contribution, I guess this was the custom, who's about to make a contribution, blowing a trumpet to announce to people they're about to do it? I'm not sure what lies behind this. It's kind of hard to figure out these rabbinic customs because much of the evidence comes from a later period. And then there's prayer, the same thing, formula, the same things are said about prayer in verse 5. Don't stand and pray in the street corners and the synagogues to be seen by men. Go into your room, shut the door, pray to your Father who's in secret, which is not outlawing public prayer, but it's outlawing ostentatious prayer. But he goes a little bit further, and in praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. For they think they will be heard for their many words. I guess this is sort of just a repetition, Krishna, Krishna, you know, all this kind of stuff. To say it over and over, there's virtue in that before you ask him. I think Jesus is saying three things, at least three things about how you ought not to pray here. He's saying you ought not to pray ostentatiously, to impress people with your prayers. Secondly, he's saying you ought not to pray with meaningless formality. Now, it's pretty bad to sit and listen to a prayer and criticize it, isn't it? And I'm not sure that those of us who sit and listen to prayers and criticize them are any better than the people who pray the prayers we're criticizing, but we do it just the same. And we don't do it so much. I think we've improved in our prayers. But you can remember the prayers where you knew what the prayer was going to say before it was said, all the way through to guard and protect us. Down in the end. I've even heard sermons like that. I remember one sermon where I knew what he was going to say before, I had the gift of clairvoyance or something. I knew what his next line was going to be because I heard it so many. But so I guess there's nothing wrong with those things if they mean something. But if it's turning your mind off and turning your mouth on, it's the sort of thing Jesus says don't do. The third thing he says that you should avoid in prayer is faithlessness. Where do you get that from? I get that from verse 8. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. We do not give God information. We made a terrible mistake. I didn't make it. Someone at Pepperdine made a terrible mistake one time. We invited a guy to lead prayer in a little chapel who wasn't one of us. I guess it wasn't a mistake because it wasn't one of us, but because he was a political science teacher, and before it was over, he'd given God his whole political program, including his condemnation of Richard Nixon for bombing Cambodia. And, he went on for about 10 minutes laying out his whole politics and had to be informed about them. We do this at chapel. The way we get kids to be quiet for chapel at ACU is and they come in, they love to talk to each other, and it's not really a bad 3,000-4,000 kids there. So when we get up and say, now we have the following prayer requests, it's just a prayer request, and then the person who gets up to lead the prayer has to repeat them all in detail with embroidering. Like, we want to pray for so-and-so because his grandfather is ill, and so, we want to pray for so-and-so's grandfather. We all know how much we love our grandparents and how much they mean to us and so forth and so on, and so we just want to pray for them. And I appreciate the sincerity of that and so forth, but it's almost as if God didn't get the message the first time. And we need to repeat it in case he wasn't listening to this kind of thing. Prayer is not to give information to God. I don't think it's to give information to the audience either. A sermon does that. Why do we pray if God already knows? It's an exhibition of faith. It's saying, we deal with this in terms of committing it to you. We lay it before you. We don't handle it ourselves. We give it to you. And so God, to say what Roy said last night, I think God wants us to give that exhibition of faith, to say we don't handle life ourselves, we handle it by giving it to you. And I think that's what's being said in verse 8. You don't give information to the Father, but you commit yourself in faith to the Father with those prayer concerns. That's how not to pray. The Lord's Prayer, beginning in verse 9, tells us how to pray. I wish we had, but I would like to say, even though I was taught you don't call it the Lord's Prayer and you don't pray it, I would like to say I believe this is the basic Christian prayer. I don't think it would have been included in the Gospels if it wasn't. If it is a relic that is irrelevant, why in the world, when the Gospels were written down 40 years after Jesus was raised, was it included? If it had nothing to do with the church, why even put it in? I believe it is the basic prayer. Furthermore, I am convinced that everything, if you understand it in the fullest sense, in the broadest sense, everything God wants to give us is here in this prayer. Notice nothing is said about praying for green lights all the way downtown, or about praying for a parking place when you get there, and all of those kinds of things, as if somehow those things are part of God's great plan for humanity. Maybe God will teach you patience by giving you red lights all the way downtown. I think sometimes people pray for very self-centered things and very trivial things, but I found out that you can get in less trouble coming into the church and saying, let's bring an organ in tonight, than you get into by contradicting people's view of prayer. Does that make sense? That people get angrier if you contradict their view of prayer than if you say, let's get an organ in the church. They really, and you know where I think we've gotten a lot of our view from prayer from? Our view of prayer from TV. TV evangelists. And their view of prayer, which I think sometimes is sloppy. But that's where we get it from, because that's what we watch. This is what God wants to do. This is what we really need. One of the members where I preach taught for a year at Oral Roberts University, and he had a friend on the faculty there who was seriously praying that God would redo the molecular structure of his automobile engine because he needed piston rings and couldn't afford them. Cure his car. As if that matters. Our prayers can be selfish. Someone else was praying that God would take care of the termites in his house because he couldn't afford a termite exterminator. I don't find that here. I think that's a selfish concern. That is not a concern that has to do with God's great purposes for man. Now, some of you are going to come up and object to that. That's all right. You have the right. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. The next illustration has to do with fasting. Verse 16, when you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites. They disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by men. They have their reward. Oh, they're fasting. When you fast, anoint your head, wash your face. Your fasting may not be seen by men, but by your Father who is in secret. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I like to talk to my students, about how different this is than the usual point of view. We get up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, get in there and fight. I've got to go out and face the world. We don't want to scare them. And also the students, the girls want the boys to think they're nice looking. The boys want the girls to think they're handsome. And so they spend a considerable amount of time in front of the mirror repairing the damage and trying to look presentable. I mean, compare how most people look when they first get up in the morning with how they look when they go out in public. Isn't it a remarkable difference? But if you're fasting, if you're a person who looks good when they get up in the morning, they got to get in front of the mirror and spend all that time looking terrible. They've got to disfigure their faces. If I go out looking good, no one will know I've been fasting. Fortunately, when I get up in the morning, I have the kind of face which will indicate to all that I've been fasting. All I have to do is stick outside and they'll say, hey, you've been fasting, don't you? You look terrible. It's kind of strange to imagine anyone deliberately trying to look bad. Well, you haven't been eating. You're on a fast? Yeah? Oh, how marvelous. I wonder if Jesus had a sense of humor when he said that. I think he must have. The second half of the chapter has to do with materialism. Who can define materialism? Well, I think materialism is when you make what God has made more important than the one who made it. It is another of those ways that our culture influences us, because I think Americans deal with a dilemma, a real problem. One half of the dilemma is that we are taught every day, for the most part in subtle ways, to be materialistic. Billboards, TV ads about the recession and the economy. I mean, get USA Today, a whole section, a fourth of the paper has to do with the economy. Constantly seeing ads on television for periodicals that will tell you how to make money. Get things. This is the American way. It's un-American not to want to acquire. And so we have all of this. And if you don't get your raise, you're really unhappy. And if so we're constantly trying to move up here. So we have this really acquisitive point of view, and we have sanctified it by calling it American or progress or success or whatever. So there is a certain amount of acquisitiveness here. But the other side of this dilemma, is that we feel terribly guilty about it. So I tell my students, many of whom live in apartments which are far from the Taj Mahal, I tell my students, no matter how bad your apartment is, you're living in a place right now better than probably a third of the world's population lives in. They'd be glad to come live in your apartment. What they have doesn't even compare to what you're living in. And we feel guilty if we've got too much, we spend too much. And you buy something expensive, you feel guilty about it because you know how many people are going without. And then we hear about people in Portland who don't have enough to eat. Stories about starvation in Ethiopia and all the people in India who die every day. You know, a lot of those are political problems. Even if you send the food, you can't get it to the people who need it. But we feel guilty. So we're in a terrible dilemma. And what we sort of want is for someone to come along and say, now, if you will take your gross income and you will give X% of that, that'll take care of this business and you won't have to worry about it anymore. The rest you can do whatever you want with and you won't have to feel any guilt. That's what we want. How many times in the church have you heard someone say, what percent must I give? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just nail that thing down and that would be the end of it? And Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus has this irritating way of giving us principles. And so no one is ever going to be able to say to you, give X%. We can do the whole business we want about the Old Testament, you know, and they gave a tithe and we've got whatever validity that has, but that's still, you know, it's still, you've got to make a decision in terms of your relationship to the Lord, and you've got to consider how much He's given to you and how much you love other people and how great the need is and all this kind of thing and where your values are and what you're making most important in your life. And to tell the truth, I still haven't got that one figured out. And to give you another truth, I hope I never get it figured out. I hope I'm a little bit uneasy about this for the rest of my life. Columbia Christian makes appeals for money. I'm sure many of you give to Columbia. Those of you who teach here are certainly giving to Columbia. And they make the appeal and you say, well, I can do so much. But the truth of the matter is, myself included, and I've been giving to the school probably, nearly every one of us, if we really decided to squeeze, could do more. This is not a pitch for Columbia, you understand? I'm just trying to illustrate the point. If we really tried to squeeze, we could do more. Some maybe couldn't, but most of us could. So how do you make those decisions, you see? How do you decide those kinds of things? While I've been away from home, we had for our hot tub. Now, do I need a hot tub? And do I need to spend $375 for a concrete pad? Could I have given that money to Columbia? Of course, the hot tub's not my fault. It's my wife's Christmas present. For 3 Christmases. Also 3 birthdays. Also 3 wedding anniversaries. If I'm going to spend that much money, I'm going to get 3 years' worth out of it. It's not going to be just one present. So we struggle with these things. Someone could say, well, you know, that's pretty materialistic, Ash. You've got a hot tub out there. Yeah, but it feels so good after a run to get in. It just feels good. It's valuable for my health. I'll live 2 years longer because I have a hot tub, and I can serve more people and preach more sermons and make more people suffer and so forth and so on. So we have 4 passages that deal with this. We have treasures, and the point of treasures is not, you better be generous or else. The point of the treasures passage in verses 19 through 21 is, you need to realize what the truth is. You can put your heart wherever you want, but what a tragedy it is to invest in something which is going to disappear. Because that's the nature of material treasure. Do you want to do that? That's not very smart. To spend your whole life grubbing and worrying and being anxious over something which is going to rot. So Jesus is just appealing here to common sense. You want a good investment? Let me tell you a good investment. Invest in treasures in heaven. That pays a great return, and you're not going to have any problem with an S&L failing or whatever. Sound eye, I think, in verses 22 and 23 is talking about values. This is the eye is the lamp of the body. I think it's saying, what's your primary value? And since it's in the context of material things, I think he's saying, is your primary value your relation to God or your relation to things? Because your primary value, the thing that's most important in your life, is going to color everything else that comes in, just as your eye lets in all the impressions from the outside, and we have vision. And the quality of your eyesight has to do with how you perceive the outside world. I ask freshmen, what are your values? They say, huh? We've all got them, we don't know what they are necessarily. What is your value system? What is that filter through which everything else comes? Is it your relation to God? So you decide about sports, and you decide about marriage, and you decide about job, and you decide about everything else in terms of your relation to God, or is it your relation to material things? Words of Jesus on serving two masters, I think, again, he's just saying something everybody knows. In an institution of slavery, you understand you can't do it. So what do you do with material things? Do you serve them or do you use them? Because both God and mammon are jealous masters. And we all know that God wants everything we have because he gave us everything we have. But mammon's the same way. Once you get into that trap of acquisition, it's just like a disease. It gets hold of you. And then finally you have in verses 25 through 34 the passage on anxiety. And one of the reasons we have trouble being generous is because we're worried about tomorrow. At least that's my problem. I say to myself, why not? This is going to be radical. I'm not going to do it, folks, but it's an illustration. Why not just take all your investments, which in my case isn't much, and cash them all in and give the money away where there are needs? Why not do that? And then the little voice inside says, but what about retirement? What if you get the big C? What if you lose your job? What if? You better provide for the... And that's sensible. I understand that. That's sensible. And I'm not saying we shouldn't provide for the future, because what's going to happen when I die is in my retirement years I'll be living off that interest, and what's left, the principal is going to come to some school, probably, like Columbia or Abilene or somewhere. So it's really not as bad as it seems, but the point is fear, anxiety. So Jesus gives a whole series of illustrations to say you shouldn't let fear make you materialistic. He uses four arguments. The first argument is in verse 25. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? What is he saying? I think he's saying this. Where did your life come from? God. Is it a greater miracle to create a life in the beginning or to put food into that life to keep it going? Why, obviously it's a greater miracle to create life in the beginning. Well, now, if you believe God did that, if he did A, he can certainly do B, which is lesser. He can keep putting fuel in that life to keep it going. You've already granted the premise that God has the power to create life. Now, certainly you can accept the lesser premise that God has the power to give you food. The same thing is true of the second part of it, the body more than clothing. Where'd your body come from? God. If he's already done the greater miracle of creating your body, can't he do the lesser miracle of giving you something to put on it? Well, yeah, I guess so. That argument's been very helpful to me when I've thought about it. Use common sense and think about what you already know, and you reason from that, you understand that what he did, he can provide for. Second argument's the one about the birds of the air. Birds of the air are not farmers, but God takes care of them. And you're worth more than a bird. The how much more type argument. Third argument, verse 27, which of you by being anxious can add 1 cubit to his span of life? I am so stupid that I read that passage for 30 years without realizing the problem. I couldn't understand why some translations said add 1 cubit to your stature. Why would they want to do that? Until it finally dawned on me that the cubit is not a measure of length, not a measure of years, it's a measure of length. And it's like saying, how can you add 18 inches to your life? How can you live 18 inches longer? So I don't know what the explanation of that is, but the point is that the length of life is not in your control. It's in God's control, so why not trust it to God? And the fourth argument's the one about the lilies, which spring up in the springtime in Palestine and are the clothing for the grass. But grass is not very important because by the middle of the summer the grass is withered and they gather it up and make fires out of it. And so if the grass, as unimportant as it is given such marvelous clothing, then God will clothe you. Again, the how much more argument. Now we think about those things. They're meant to say something to us. So don't worry about these things. God knows you need them. Put God first in your life. Sort of a climax of this whole section is seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be yours as well. I wish I had time to talk to you about the text beginning in 7:13 to the end, the 4 reasons why people won't do it. I want to say a word about the narrow gate, 7:13, enter by the narrow gate. This is another of those texts, I think, that we've misused to make people feel terrible. We leave the impression with people that they can't get in the narrow gate, most of them, And so as a result, this is one of those sermons that leads us to come away saying a few people in this church are going to heaven, but not me. Anyone can get in the narrow gate that wants. Anyone can go that wants. It's not narrow because people can't go in, it's narrow because people won't go in. And the problem here, as I understand it, is that Jesus is saying people are not going to respond to me because most people just don't want to pay the price. They just don't want to do it. It's easier not to. Well, that's a marvelous thing you're saying, Jesus, a marvelous reward, but I just don't feel like it. It's really too much work. I'd rather sit home and watch a ball game on TV than do all that. Not that you can't go, it's that the fact of the matter is most people won't go, and so Jesus is too difficult. I like that wide way. And he's saying what you got to remember is no matter how attractive, gates, all lit up, and got the first part of that path really looks glitzy, and over here the narrow gate probably kind of, tawdry. But what do you got to understand? Down there's a bend in the road, and every path goes somewhere. And if you get in the path and keep going, you got to end up where it goes. And no matter how glitzy it looks in the beginning, the end is destruction. No matter how ordinary the other one looks, the end is life. I'd like to talk about that, but I haven't got time. It's time to go eat lunch. Thank you so much. God bless you.